The bunting is still hanging in London, but the docks are quiet. It is the spring of 1947. Less than 2 years after victory, Britain's ports tell a story the parades never did. Cargo ships sit idle, cranes stand motionless, warehouses echo with emptiness. Inside homes across the country, ration cards are counted carefully, not as a wartime sacrifice, but as a permanent reality. And behind closed doors, Britain's currency, once the backbone of global trade, is under pressure the government can no longer control. There is no invasion, no bombing, no defeat on the battlefield. Yet Britain is closer to financial collapse than at any point in the war itself. What happened next would quietly end an empire. To understand how, we need to confront a truth that was carefully managed at the time. Britain did not emerge from World War II weakened only by physical destruction. It emerged trapped by debt, dependent on foreign support, and committed to a financial strategy that could not survive the post-war world. In 1945, Britain stood among the victors. Its armed forces had fought across continents. Its navy still spanned the globe. Its political leaders spoke the language of continuity, of rebuilding, reform, and renewed leadership. But the numbers told a different story. The war had drained Britain's reserves to historic lows. Overseas investments, built up over generations, had been sold off to pay for food, fuel, and weapons. Industrial output was exhausted. Infrastructure was worn down, and the country relied on imports for survival, paid for with foreign currency it no longer earned in sufficient quantities. Britain's strength had always rested on trade and finance as much as force. Now both were failing. The pound sterling, once a pillar of the global economy, was under strain. Britain still tried to present it as a stable international currency, used across its empire and beyond. But maintaining that image required resources Britain no longer possessed. Dollars were scarce. Gold reserves were thin, and confidence once lost is difficult to restore. This was the background to the crisis that would erupt in 1947. That year brought a brutal winter, but the cold only exposed deeper problems. Coal shortages disrupted industry. Export targets were missed. Recovery plans stalled. Britain needed to earn hard currency to pay for essential imports, yet its economy could not produce enough for export without fuel, materials, and investment. The gap widened quickly. Inside government offices, financial officials confronted an impossible balance. Britain was trying to do 3 things at once: rebuild at home, maintain a global empire, and defend a currency system designed for a pre-war world. Each goal undermined the others. Rebuilding required imports and spending. Empire required overseas commitments and military presence. Sterling stability required confidence and reserves. Britain could not afford all 3. Publicly, leaders emphasized resilience and reform. Privately, they faced mounting pressure from abroad. Wartime financial arrangements were ending. Emergency support came with expectations. Britain was no longer negotiating from a position of strength. This was the first major turning point. In the summer of 1947, Britain made a critical decision about its currency, one intended to restore confidence and demonstrate financial credibility. Instead, it exposed how fragile the system had become. Controls were loosened in hopes of stabilizing trade and attracting trust. The result was catastrophic. Sterling came under immediate attack. Reserves drained at an alarming pace. What had been a managed strain turned into a visible crisis. Britain was forced to reverse course, but the damage was done. The world had seen the weakness. This moment mattered far beyond economics. Currency was power. Sterling was not just money. It was the connective tissue of empire. It allowed Britain to trade, to finance overseas commitments, to maintain influence without direct force. When confidence in sterling faltered, the foundations of imperial control began to crack. From this point on, Britain's choices narrowed rapidly. Defending the currency meant cutting spending. Cutting spending meant reducing overseas commitments. Reducing commitments meant accepting a smaller global role, whether the public realized it or not. The crisis of 1947 did not announce the end of empire. It revealed that the empire could no longer be afforded. Rationing tightened rather than eased. Military deployments were reconsidered. Financial priorities shifted decisively inward. The language of leadership gave way to the language of survival. What made this collapse silent was not its scale, but its management. There were no dramatic headlines declaring imperial retreat. Instead, there were technical decisions, emergency measures, and quiet reversals that reshaped Britain's future, step by step. By the end of 1947, one thing was clear to those who saw the numbers. Britain was no longer choosing whether to lead an empire. It was choosing which parts of that empire to let go. And once that process began, it would not stop, because the forces unleashed by Britain's financial crisis were larger than any single policy or government. They would accelerate decisions that had once seemed unthinkable and force Britain to confront a reality far removed from the victory celebrations of just 2 years earlier. That acceleration, driven by pressure from abroad and limits at home, is where the next chapter of this story begins. By early 1948, the crisis was no longer contained within balance sheets. It was shaping Britain's choices in the world. The pound had survived the immediate shock of 1947, but only through emergency controls and reputational damage that could not be undone. Confidence had been shaken. Reserves remained dangerously low, and Britain's recovery now depended on decisions made beyond its own borders. This was the escalation phase, the point where financial weakness translated directly into geopolitical constraint. Britain needed dollars, not pounds, not promises, dollars, to buy food, fuel, machinery, and raw materials. Without them, industry stalled, and living standards fell further. The empire, once a source of strength, no longer generated the hard currency required to sustain itself. This dependence reshaped negotiations behind closed doors. Post-war aid arrived with conditions. Britain was expected to liberalize trade, reduce imperial preferences, and accept a world economy no longer centered on sterling. These demands were framed as modernization. In practice, they dismantled the financial architecture that had supported Britain's global reach. Imperial trade systems designed to favor sterling and British markets came under pressure. Restrictions that once protected Britain's balance of payments were portrayed as obstacles to recovery. Britain faced a stark reality. Access to external support required surrendering control over how its economy and empire functioned. At the same time, domestic pressure intensified. Rationing continued into what should have been a period of peace and abundance. Coal shortages limited production. Housing shortages deepened public frustration. The promise that sacrifice would end with victory rang hollow. The public sensed hardship, but not its cause. Inside government, the debate grew sharper. Every overseas commitment had a price. Bases required maintenance. Troops required pay and supplies. Administrations required funding. Each decision to remain present abroad meant fewer resources at home. Financial officials increasingly questioned whether prestige justified the cost. The empire was no longer a source of net gain. It had become a financial liability. This realization did not lead to an immediate announcement of retreat. Instead, it produced a series of quiet reassessments. Military deployments were reviewed. Investment priorities shifted. Some commitments were downgraded. Others were postponed indefinitely. The logic was always financial. Britain still thought strategically. It still spoke as a global power. But its actions were increasingly shaped by constraints it could not escape. Currency weakness dictated defense policy. Trade deficits influenced diplomacy. Economic survival took precedence over imperial symbolism. Meanwhile, the global environment had changed. Other nations were rebuilding faster. Industrial capacity elsewhere surged. Britain's relative position slipped year by year. Sterling zones shrank as confidence eroded. Countries once tied closely to Britain began seeking alternatives. The empire's cohesion depended on trust in Britain's economic leadership. That trust was fading. This was the hidden pressure point. As long as Britain could present itself as financially stable, imperial authority held. Once that illusion weakened, loyalty became conditional. Economic ties loosened. Political calculations shifted. Britain's ability to shape outcomes through finance diminished rapidly. By the late 1942s, officials confronted an uncomfortable truth. Britain was no longer managing decline on its own terms. It was reacting to markets, to creditors, to allies whose priorities did not align with imperial preservation. The timetable was accelerating, driven by forces Britain could influence only at the margins. Attempts to defend sterling absorbed enormous energy. Controls were tightened. Exports were prioritized, often at the expense of domestic consumption. Recovery plans became exercises in damage limitation rather than growth. Yet even these efforts could not reverse the underlying imbalance. Britain's economy was too small, its reserves too thin, its commitments too large. The post-war world rewarded scale, productivity, and financial depth. Britain had tradition and experience, but not the surplus required to sustain empire. This escalation culminated in a broader shift in thinking. Policymakers began to accept that retrenchment was not temporary. It was structural. The question was no longer how to restore Britain's old position, but how to adapt to a reduced one without open humiliation. That adaptation required painful choices. Some territories were prepared for transition. Others were deemed unsustainable. Military presence was redefined. Diplomatic influence was recalibrated. Each step reduced cost, but also reduced reach. To the public, these changes appeared incremental. A base closed here, a commitment revised there. But taken together, they marked a decisive move away from imperial maintenance. The crisis that began as a currency problem was now reshaping Britain's global identity. What had been unthinkable in 1945 was becoming inevitable by the end of the decade. The empire could not be defended by rhetoric or memory. It required money Britain did not have and could not easily acquire. The escalation phase ended with a grim clarity. Britain had survived the immediate collapse, but survival had come at a price, and the most difficult consequences, the ones that would expose the full cost of financial weakness, were still ahead. By the start of the 1952s, Britain's financial strain reached its breaking point. What had once been managed quietly could no longer be disguised as adjustment or reform. The limits imposed by debt, currency weakness, and external dependence now collided with Britain's desire to act as an independent global power. The result was a moment of reckoning that exposed just how far the country's position had eroded since 1945. This was the phase where illusion met reality. Britain still possessed institutions, experience, and a sense of historic authority. But power depends on the ability to act, and by this stage, every major action carried a financial cost Britain could not sustain without outside approval. The breaking point arrived when Britain attempted to assert itself on the world stage, as if the old foundations still existed. Behind the scenes, officials understood the risk. Currency reserves were fragile. Sterling required constant defense. Any shock could trigger another crisis like 1947, this time with far fewer tools to contain it. Yet strategic instincts, shaped by decades of imperial leadership, pushed Britain toward decisions that exceeded its economic capacity. When pressure mounted, the consequences were immediate. Financial markets reacted with speed and indifference. Confidence in sterling weakened once again. Reserves drained. Emergency measures were discussed almost as soon as decisions were announced. Britain's margin for error had vanished. This was the moment when the price of post-war survival became unmistakable. Those who benefited from Britain's retrenchment were not hidden. Other powers stepped into roles Britain could no longer afford. Trade routes adjusted. Security arrangements evolved. Financial leadership shifted decisively away from London. Britain paid the price in autonomy. Key decisions now required consultation. Strategic options were weighed against currency implications. Military planning was inseparable from financial approval. Britain remained influential, but no longer decisive on its own. At home, the impact deepened public disillusionment. Rationing lingered long after the war had ended. Promises of prosperity felt hollow. The idea that victory had secured Britain's future no longer matched everyday experience. Yet the true cause, structural financial weakness, remained poorly understood outside expert circles. This disconnect mattered. It allowed the narrative of decline to remain fragmented. Instead of a single moment of loss, Britain experienced a series of constrained choices, each justified as temporary or necessary. Together, they represented a permanent shift in national position. The empire bore the cost most visibly. Territories once defended as vital were reassessed as expendable. Administration became more expensive than influence. Local demands for autonomy grew as Britain's ability to enforce authority weakened. Financial reality accelerated political change. Britain did not lose its empire through a single act of betrayal or defeat. It lost it through accumulated inability to pay. This was the major mistake of the post-war years. Believing that imperial reach could be preserved through careful management alone. The assumption underestimated how decisively economic power had moved elsewhere. By clinging to a global role it could no longer finance, Britain delayed adaptation and made the eventual reckoning more abrupt. When the breaking point came, it was not marked by dramatic collapse. It was marked by exposure of dependency, exposure of limits, exposure of a gap between identity and capability. Those who benefited were the emerging architects of the new global order. They gained influence not through conquest, but through financial capacity and stability. They shaped rules, institutions, and expectations that Britain now had to navigate rather than command. Britain, in contrast, entered a period of reassessment. Some officials argued for realism, accepting a reduced role and rebuilding strength gradually. Others struggled to reconcile that view with the legacy of empire and sacrifice. The debate was intense, but the outcome was constrained by numbers that could not be argued away. The collapse, when it came, was not a collapse of government or society. It was a collapse of assumption. The assumption that Britain could still act independently on a global scale. The assumption that victory guaranteed leadership. The assumption that empire could survive without economic dominance. By the early 1952s, these assumptions were no longer credible. Britain remained a significant nation. It retained influence, culture, and alliances. But the era in which it could define outcomes through its own power had ended. This realization reshaped everything that followed. The final stage of this story is not about loss alone, but about what replaced empire, and how Britain came to terms with a world where financial strength, not history, determined influence. That reckoning, and its lasting consequences, is where the story concludes. By the mid-1952s, the transformation was complete. Britain had not collapsed. Its cities still stood, its institutions still functioned, its voice still carried weight in international forums. But the foundations of imperial power, financial independence, currency dominance, and the ability to act without permission were gone. What replaced them was something quieter, narrower, and more realistic. The final outcome of the 1947 crisis was not a single decision, but a settled understanding. Britain accepted that its future could no longer be built on empire. It would instead be built on recovery, alliance, and adaptation to a world where economic strength defined leadership. This acceptance reshaped policy across the board. Sterling was no longer treated as a global reserve currency in waiting. It became a managed national currency, defended carefully rather than promoted ambitiously. Controls remained part of economic life for years, reflecting how fragile confidence still was. Britain focused on earning stability, not prestige. Imperial commitments continued to unwind. Some territories moved toward independence through negotiated transitions. Others were redefined within looser frameworks of association. Britain aimed to preserve influence where possible, but without the financial burden of direct control. The language of partnership replaced the language of rule. This shift was not purely ideological. It was forced by arithmetic. Every overseas commitment now faced scrutiny. Could it be paid for? Could it be justified to a population still living with shortages? Could it survive without undermining economic recovery at home? Often, the answer was no. The long-term impact of this retrenchment was profound. Britain emerged as a different kind of power. It remained diplomatically active. It invested in social reform and domestic reconstruction. It sought relevance through cooperation rather than command. The welfare state expanded even as global reach contracted, an exchange that defined the post-war era. Internationally, Britain adjusted to a supporting role within larger structures. Influence came through alignment, negotiation, and expertise, rather than unilateral action. This adaptation was sometimes uncomfortable, but it proved more sustainable than clinging to an imperial past. The world also changed in response. Former colonies pursued their own paths. Global trade reorganized. Financial centers shifted. The post-war order stabilized around new economic realities, ones that rewarded productivity, scale, and fiscal depth over legacy and symbolism. Britain's experience became a lesson rather than a template. It showed that victory in war does not guarantee security in peace, that empires can end without invasion, and that economic collapse does not always announce itself with panic. It can arrive through spreadsheets, policy memoranda, and quiet reversals. The silence of Britain's financial collapse was its most defining feature. There was no single day when the empire ended, no declaration that power had passed. Instead, there was a sequence of constrained choices, each rational on its own, together irreversible. By the time the public fully sensed what had changed, the outcome was already settled. Yet this story is not only one of decline. Britain survived the crisis. It rebuilt. Living standards eventually rose. Democratic institutions endured. The country found a new identity, less grand, perhaps, but more stable. The cost was empire. The crisis of 1947 marked the moment when Britain crossed from imperial power to post-imperial state. Not because it wanted to, not because it failed militarily, but because it could no longer afford the role it once played. That is the deeper truth behind the end of empire. It was not taken. It was not conquered. It was priced out. And in that sense, Britain's silent financial collapse remains one of the clearest examples of how economic reality shapes history more decisively than any battlefield victory. The flags lowered quietly. The ships sailed less often. And the empire faded not with a fall, but with a calculation.